What's up everybody, my name is Moss Norman, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to write a simple Jenkins pipeline script. It's not going to be a fancy pipeline script, it'll be a bare bones Jenkins pipeline script to get you up and running and familiar with the concept of declarative pipelines in Jenkins. I'm also going to make the Jenkins pipeline script that we write today available on GitHub, and I've included a link to that repository in GitHub below. When we're finished writing our pipeline script, it should look something like this. And in order to follow along with this tutorial, you'll need a few prerequisites. The first prerequisite is admin access to a Jenkins server. Secondly, the Jenkins pipeline plugin has to be installed on that Jenkins server. You'll also need the Jenkins plugin for Git. And in this tutorial, I'm going to be using and checking out code from GitHub, so you'll need a GitHub account as well. The code that our pipeline is going to be running is C code, so you'll need the GCC compiler. And although I'm not going to walk through writing that C code in this tutorial, I've made the code that we're going to run in this pipeline available in a GitHub repository, and I've also linked that below. If we take a look at the code that our pipeline is going to be running, it's a simple C program that is actually utilizing the POSIX threads library. So it's a multi-threaded program, and basically it just has one worker thread function and then a main function that is going to create create a thread and then execute that worker thread function. And inside that worker thread function, we're just simply printing out hello world, this is thread, and then printing the ID of that particular thread. Now before we begin, real quickly, I just want to go over what a Jenkins pipeline is. When we want to deliver a new software feature to our customers, we perform a set of steps in sequence to get that feature out into production where our customers can consume it. And that process includes a step to build and compile our source code of our new feature, a step to test that the built source code functions as we expect it to, and finally a step to deploy that new feature to the infrastructure that our customers access our service on. And although this process could be carried out manually, Jenkins gives us the ability to entirely automate each step of this process, making the pipeline of delivery more efficient and less error prone. Now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we want to do is set up a new pair of SSH credentials in Jenkins. I've already created an SSH key pair on my machine, so I'm not going to go through the process of creating one here. What I'm going to do is copy the SSH private key into Jenkins, and then I'm going to add the public key of that SSH key pair to my GitHub account. And that will allow Jenkins to communicate and authenticate with my GitHub profile and download the code that it needs to in order to execute this pipeline. So to create a new credential, I'm going to go up here to Manage Jenkins. I'm going to select Manage Credentials. I'll select Jenkins. And then I'm going to select Global Credentials. And then I'm going to select Add Credentials. And from the kind dropdown, I'm going to select SSH username with private key. I'm going to give it an ID of GitHub SSH key 2 because I already have an SSH key pair with the name GitHub SSH key. The username is going to be Moss. And then the private key, I'm going to select Enter Directly. I'm going to open up my terminal here, and I'm going to cat my private key. And let's just go ahead and copy that private key. And then I'm going to select Add and paste that private key into the private key entry field. And I don't have a passphrase on that SSH key, so I'm going to leave that blank, and then I'm going to click OK. Okay, so I've added the private key to Jenkins, and now I need to add the public key to my GitHub profile. So to do that, I'm going to navigate to GitHub. And from GitHub, I'm going to go to Settings. And then down to SSH keys. I'm going to create a new SSH key, and I'll give it a title as two. And now I need to copy the public key, and to do that I'm just going to cat that out. I'll copy that public key and paste it into my GitHub profile, and then select Add SSH Key. Okay. And here it tells me that the key is already in use, so I'm going to actually delete the previous one. Let's see, I'll delete that SSH key. Perfect. And let me try and add that again. Just save. Two, and then I'll click Add SSH Key. Okay, and that successfully added it. So now if Jenkins tries to communicate with my GitHub profile, it should be able to authenticate and clone down or write to repositories in my GitHub account. Now that we have that SSH key pair set up, we can begin writing our Jenkins pipeline. So I'm going to pull up VS Code here, and we are going to start defining our Jenkins pipeline. So the first thing that we'll need is the pipeline declaration, or the pipeline block. And the pipeline declaration will contain everything that needs to be executed within the whole pipeline job. And the first thing that we'll want to do inside of the pipeline block is call out agent any. And when we specify agent any, what we're telling Jenkins is to use any available executor and workspace for this pipeline job. And this agent keyword is declarative pipeline specific syntax. Now, after specifying that this pipeline can be run on any agent, what we'll then define are the stages to be executed in this pipeline. And stages are what we use to break up the logical steps in that diagram that I showed earlier. So we'll create a stage for building our code, testing our code, and deploying our code, as well as a stage for checking out our code from GitHub. And to begin defining our stages, we want to declare the stages block in our pipeline job. Once we have this block, we can begin defining our individual stages. So the first stage that we're going to define is checking out our code base from the SCM tool, so that we can build, test, and deploy it locally from this Jenkins server. So I'm going to call this stage checkout codebase. Now within a stage, we can define what's called steps. So each stage can have multiple steps, which are individual units of action that will be executed within a particular stage. So let's go ahead and create a steps block. And the only step that we have in this particular stage is just checking out the code from GitHub. And to do that, what we're going to do is invoke checkout SCM. And checkout SCM takes as a parameter the class, which is in this case is Git SCM. And this is an array of arguments that you pass into the checkout SCM command. So I'm going to specify the class as Git SCM, followed by a comma, and then the next argument is going to be user remote configs. And the configs are going to be a two-dimensional array of Git configs that we're going to use to authenticate with GitHub. So the first input here is going to be the credentials ID, and this is referring to the ID of the credentials that we created in Jenkins not too long ago. And that ID was GitHub SSH key 2, I believe. Let me just double check that that was the GitHub SSH key -2. Yep, that's correct. Okay, and the next argument is going to be the URL of the GitHub repository, and so that's just going to be git@github.com, my username, / the name of my repository, which is multi-threading example 1.git, and then we'll close out the arrays and those arguments. Okay. So what this should do, if it works correctly, it should check out this multi-threading example repository and download it into Jenkins, this builds, or this pipeline builds particular workspace. Now our next stage, now that we've completed the checkout, our next stage is going to be the build stage. So let's go ahead and define a new stage, and we'll call it the build stage. And within the build stage, since this is C code, we're going to compile it using GCC. So I'm going to define a steps block, and within steps, I'm going to invoke SH. So we can use SH within a Jenkins pipeline to basically execute a shell command. So I'm going to invoke SH and then pass in as an argument the command that I would enter at the command line if I were directly using the command line. So I'll say GCC and then mt example-0.c, and then I'm linking the pthreads library. Since this is a multi-threaded program, I have to link the pthread library, otherwise this program won't compile and it won't work because it needs to have the pthreads library. Now that we've written the build stage, let's go ahead and write the test stage. So I'm going to create a new stage here, call it test, and then define the steps. And the only step that we're going to take in this case, if the build stage compiles the code successfully, we'll go into the test stage. And in order to test the code, we don't have any formal tests. I'm just going to make sure that the program actually executes and we don't get any runtime errors. So that will really be our very informal test of this particular program. So I'm going to do sh, and then I'm going to run the program, the compiled program, which will just by default be a.out. So that should run the program, and we should get a message printed out to the console output of this particular Jenkins build. And the final stage is going to be our deploy stage. So I'm going to just create another stage here and call it deploy, and outline our steps again. And in our steps, I'm not going to do anything fancy here. I'm just going to simply print out to the console, done. Okay, but in this particular stage, what would typically happen if this were like production environment, you'd be deploying your tested code to infrastructure, or updating some server or something like that to make sure that this code gets pushed to production. So now that we've written our pipeline, let's go ahead and save it, and to make it like a legitimate pipeline, we have to name it Jenkins file. So I'm going to save it in this directory here, and I'm going to call it Jenkins file. Okay. And I'm going to make this a new Git repository. So we want this Jenkins file, it's best practice to version control your Jenkins pipeline scripts. So what I'm going to do, I've got the Jenkins file in this directory. I'm going to initialize it as a Git repository. Okay. And then I'm going to create a new GitHub repo and push this Jenkins file to that GitHub repo. So I'm going to go back to GitHub, and I'm going to create a new repository. I'm going to call it simple Jenkins pipeline. -2, and I'll leave it as public, and I'm not going to create a README file or anything like that. I'll click create repository, and I'm going to copy the commands that they provide here to push an existing repository. So I'm just going to copy that, and then we're going to paste those 3 commands in here to and before I push my my changes, I have to actually make a new commit. So I'm going to add the Jenkins file to Git history. So I'm going to make my first commit, and now I can actually perform those previous commands. Okay, so we've successfully pushed the Jenkins pipeline up to GitHub. Now I have this Jenkins file, and it's version controlled, which, like I said, is a best practice. And now Jenkins can actually pull this this pipeline script directly from GitHub. So I'm going to navigate back to GitHub, or Jenkins, I'm sorry. And I'm going to create a new pipeline job. So I'm going to select new item from the Jenkins homepage. I'm going to select pipeline, and then I'm going to say simple pipeline 2. You can name it whatever you want. I just selected 2 because I already have a pipeline named similar to that. Okay. So in this configuration page, I'm going to specify, I'm going to come down to the pipeline section, and I'm going to specify, rather than defining the pipeline script directly in the Jenkins job, I'm going to say pipeline script from SCM. So it's going to pull the script from GitHub rather than having it stored directly in the Jenkins job. And the SCM system is going to be Git. And now that I specify that it's Git, it's going to tell me, okay, where does the Jenkins pipeline script live? And I'm going to provide it with the URL of this repository. And I'm going to give it the SSH URL. So note that this is the SSH URL of the repository. And we'll go back to the configuration page. And it gives me some error here that basically tells me that it can't authenticate with GitHub, and that's because I haven't specified the credentials. And I'm going to select the credentials from this drop down here. They're both the same. This is both the same key pair, so I could have selected either one and it'll authenticate. But we're selecting the SSH key pair that we entered in Jenkins earlier. And under the branch specifier, if you notice previously, those commands that GitHub gave me actually renamed the branch to main. So I'm going to specify main here to make sure that that I'm picking up the code on the main branch. And the script path, if the Jenkins file was within subdirectories, I could specify the exact location within that Git repository here, but it is at the root directory of that GitHub repo, so I don't need to specify it any further. And I'm going to go ahead and save this pipeline. And now we have our pipeline created, and we can actually run it. Let's go ahead and run it and see if it actually builds and works as we expect it to. So I click build now, and that should trigger a new build for this pipeline job. And I'm going to select the console output so I can see what's happening. And it looks like this pipeline did work. It actually checked out. It first checked out the pipeline script. So you can see here at this step, it checked out the pipeline script so that it knew what the stages were and the steps to run. And in the first stage, we checked out our code base from GitHub, the multi-threading code base. And you can see here our pipeline stage checkout code base is right here. That's where it begins. And we check out the multi-threading code base. And after that completes, we start the build stage. And in the build stage, we actually execute a shell command which invokes GCC and compiles our multi-threaded example 0 in that particular repository. And once it's compiled, that stage is complete. We can move on to the testing stage. And in the testing stage, we actually run that compiled program, and it prints out hello world, this is thread, and then the ID of that thread. And then finally, for the deploy stage, all we do is simply echo done to the console, and it specifies that we've completed this pipeline, and it ends with a status of success. So let's go back to the pipeline job itself, and you can see the stage view. The stage view is also a plugin that comes with the Jenkins pipeline plugin that shows you the status of each of the stages for a given pipeline build. And you'll notice that even though we didn't explicitly specify this first stage here, this stage is automatically created when we use the checkout from SCM option for the Jenkins pipeline script. So this is specifying the checkout of the Jenkins pipeline script, and this stage is checking out the code base that we're actually testing. And then we see the build, test, and deploy stages. So that's pretty much it. As you can see, it's a very simple example of a Jenkins pipeline, but you can take this example and scale it up as needed. And as I said before, this Jenkins pipeline script is available in a GitHub repo that I've linked below, as well as a code that I use for the build, test, and deploy portions of this Jenkins pipeline script. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to leave them below in the comments. And if you like the video, please consider throwing a like on it. Thanks for watching.